Hello and welcome back, everybody. This is another episode of the Philosophical Liberal here on Substack. I'm delighted to be joined by Joia, my co-host and co-founder. How you doing tonight?
Oh, we're having a wonderful evening. It's been a little bit of a rough night at home, but the
Yes,
day was overall wonderful. But maybe even the rough night at home is gonna just get my fire all ready to go for our rant today.
yes, exactly. Well, I think we're on like episode maybe 10-ish, but if
Yep.
you've been following along with us out there, you know we just completed our really in-depth mini series where we call it mini series within our TPL series on our three core values of philosophical liberalism, freedom, flourishing, and greatness. Last week's episode was kind of our wrap up on all of them, and kind of how they relate to each other. And then this one is kind of the bridge or transition into what's going to be really the rest of the TPL series of breaking down our statement on philosophical liberalism, bringing it back to the original purpose of this entire series. Um, and so the question that we're posing and going to be exploring today is, why do those three core values matter for politics, for our project at 1776 forward of building a freer society? So that's the question. And as Joy alluded to, we thought we might start off with, well, as the question implies, how does it relate to politics? Well, let's get into politics. So, you know, everybody else seems to be ranting about politics these days, so we thought we would do the same. So, Joya, why don't you kick it off on this one?
Well, I had three rants that I wanted to share, but maybe we'll even preface it by talking a little bit about I like to make a distinction between healthy ranting that ultimately is positive and the kind of negative, unhealthy ranting that just ultimately doesn't go anywhere. And that really, I think, is the main problem. But let's just talk about the value of healthy ranting. Clearly, we live in a world where things are not perfect, and I would say one of the key factors of human experience and one of the glories of human experience is that things are never actually perfect, that there's always ways for us to grow and improve and better ourselves. And there can be real value in discontent, in finding things that are wrong, that can be fixed, that can be improved, and that it is very healthy to rant, and especially in your own personal life, when things aren't going the way that you want them to, when you are someone who is an idealist and you can see with that clear, burning, fiery vision what the beautiful end goal should be and then what the current reality is, there is just a healthy way to get those emotions off the table, to be expressive. You don't want to just bottle it all up inside of you. And so taking a moment to get those rants out can be very healthy. But the way that I think about it is that ultimately the best rants lead to something productive. They lead to you taking action in the world to actually make positive change. It's not just ranting for ranting's sake. And so maybe
Hmm.
I'll put that as my first rant I want to have about uh, our current culture and politics is just the state of ranting. What we see is that just people get online just to rant, just to vent negative emotion. And unfortunately, we live in a society where the social media algorithms that are prevalent today are incentivized to deliver us fear porn and rage porn. We live, I would say, at the ultimate end of the principle that if it bleeds, it leads. Social media just takes
Oh,
that to
yeah.
11, and that's what we see. And sometimes I think even the best people can get bogged down in all the ranting. And the good part of that is there often are things that are useful to rant about, but it becomes a problem when that's all you're doing, when all you're doing is just wallowing in that negative emotion. And then unfortunately, the social media algorithms just do their best to keep us in wallowing in
Sure,
that
yeah.
negative ranting instead of
Yeah.
just taking action. So that was my first rant of the day. My second rant had to do with the state of politics, the way that I see it is that it starts so much in midstream. I'm someone who always
Mm,
does want to take things back down to first principles. I think it's just as an entrepreneur, as someone with a philosophical and academic background, that's always my impetus. I was that 4-year-old child that was always asking
mhm,
why, and what for, and trying to take things down to that fundamental level. But that's just not the state of what we see in politics today. It's just here are all these issues, and then if anything, you're just encouraged to quickly come up with what is your opinion on this issue and get into debates and wrangling and ranting about that without doing that first principles approach, without bringing in a lot of that critical thought, which I think is necessary for something as important as politics is. We should be engaging in really precise, robust, critical thought about the state of what politics is and ought to be. And
mm,
then my third big rant, the big problem I have is just even the way that our political system is, the state of it now with the two parties, although I would say even systems where there's even multiple parties, that the way that the parties interact comes from a very zero sum scarcity
mm,
mindset approach, that it's really all about my team versus your team. It's often even about getting the other team to lose, even sometimes more than your team to make progress. And even just the terminology of winning and losing again makes it into this zero sum kind of conflict, and we're going to go into a lot more detail in um, just a few episodes where we're going to share our concept of the creator trader, which we see as the ideal, as the archetype to against the vision of a predator prey approach to all forms of society. But I think
mm,
that's one of the ways we definitely unfortunately see that in politics, and something I do think that we need to rise above. And as someone who's never felt comfortable with either of the two parties that exist in the United States, or really with any of their alternatives, just to maybe bring this all full circle, because they've perhaps never taken a first principles approach. Even
mm,
my impression of the current parties is that neither or none of their platforms are fully logically coherent. So I feel
mm,
that even my own approach someone could describe it as a grab bag or mismatch from what is currently out there. But I would say that would be precisely because they haven't done this first principles critical thought work to build up what ought to be a political philosophy and or platform. And just leave it by saying that ultimately that's what we want to be doing here with this project. And we're going to be moving now, as you said, from our discussion of freedom, flourishing, and greatness back to our statement, back to the political project. And so this is the transition of why this matters with those values.
I
But
love
now I want to
that.
turn it over to you and
Yeah.
give you the floor and let you go off on your own personal
Well,
rants.
well, by modern rant standards, that was pretty good, pretty diplomatic and respectful. So, but I think that's what people who've been watching us can have come to expect. You know, we try and take a more measured approach. I think, frankly, it's partly what informs even our effort to kind of offer something different from traditional ranting culture. I mean, certainly.
Which doesn't mean that I'm not really pissed off about the state
Oh,
of the
yeah,
way
yeah,
things
yeah. No,
are,
don't mistake.
but it is pissed off with a purpose.
Yes. And like you said, there is a place for ranting, and we all certainly get our outlets. You know, I guilty as charged. I'd like to think I have relatively good self-control online relative to what I see out there. But yes, I can get down into the scrum as well. To your point, I think social media often can draw out the worst of those qualities for many different reasons, which we won't get into here, but we can get into. But no, I really, I loved all three of those points. And yeah, you know, to start my rant, politics is just, It's a mess, and that's why we started this. So if there's no other, if you listen to nothing else from today's episode, it's why did we, what's the connection? It's because we're trying to rise above the mess and the scrum of today's politics. And I suspect that most people, the interesting thing to me is like when you speak to most people, they all lament similar things individually, but people seem to feel somewhat powerless, right, to do anything about it. And so I guess that's another way of noting how we've we've kind of designed this project, and even just the impetus behind our whole 1776 forward organization and movement was, I mean, selfishly was just an effort for you and me to have an outlet that was more productive and kind of rose above or called us to a higher standard above the ranting, but also that then hopefully we could share and use with other people, other like-minded and like-valued people. So, but that said, I certainly have ranted and can rant plenty. Frankly, for all of you out there listening and watching, what you see now is just really the end product of plenty of rants that both Joy and I each have respectively in our private lives and then with each other and everything else. So you're seeing the polished final point. But, I guess some specific points that I wanted to highlight in my own rant on this and just kind of the sorry state of modern politics. The first one is just kind of a lack of principles and consistency in argument. Kind of you see this, for example, it manifests in our contemporary politics. Whenever one party is out of power, they tend to be all for limiting the power of the state, and at least in the American context, with our three branches, the executive branch in particular, based on whoever's president, and whichever party's in power and has the presidency tends to go full throttle with executive power, and then it flips like the moment so that to me evidences just something fundamentally wrong with our politics, certainly if you are aiming for consistency and intellectual coherence and integrity, which we're going to argue we definitely do want. Those are good values and virtues. Another thing kind of related to this is lack, kind of what I think of as like lack of big picture coherence, or first principle, kind of to pick off of your concept, but lack of first principles thinking, or even what I like to call is kind of like unified context, like stepping back and saying, amidst all the political debates and ranting that goes on online, in person, or on the TV, whatever, is like, what are we aiming at in a given policy or political or even personality debate and discussion? Is it just about winning an argument for the sake of winning? Is it about, kind of a single issue, concrete, like on the pros and cons of tax policy or abortion, but like devoid of a broader context of like, does this aid or harm the cause of liberty and individual rights and the things we're trying to build for in a free society? That to me is another symptom of, frankly, the first one, of lack of principles and kind of coherent or logical thinking, but it's rampant, certainly. And I feel like, frankly, that is how most modern political debates and rants and arguments go down, is they just go down rabbit holes of single issue debates and challenges rather than seeing the bigger picture. And then unsurprisingly, from those two, you get kind of just a general lack of decorum and respect for differing views, which, as you already noted, has been exacerbated by social media. You know, I go back and forth on this a little, because on the one hand, if you look at the, we tend, as humans, it's natural, no knock on us, but we tend to think like we're special, including we, the specific individual human beings in this moment in time, and that like, oh, either everything's so great or so bad, uniquely bad for our time versus any other. But when you actually I guess one of the benefits of studying history is to see how not special, or at least I guess not unique, a lot of the problems and behaviors and everything are that we are. So on the one hand, if you look at the whole history of humanity, all it has been fights over power and arguing and ranting and debating and disagreeing, So, that's, you could say, maybe innate to human nature, but at the same time, we are trying to evolve and we have the benefit of thousands of years of history and development where, to your point, frankly, perhaps maybe all that history evidenced the zero sum mentality that we largely operated under as a species. But now that we've reached a point where we can transcend that, where we see clearly and have achieved materially an alternative state of living that is not zero sum, that maybe now our politics and debate needs to move in that direction as well. So, I yes, social media exacerbates the lack of decorum and disrespect, but that is also not a new phenomenon. And maybe, it maybe just makes it more acute or more obvious, right? Um, so perhaps this isn't even just a contemporary complaint, but just, how do we make discourse, and particularly political discourse, more civil in general and going forward? Um, and, kind of alongside that is just the tribalism over principles. You talked about this too, but, kind of, you know, fighting for your side and only your side, kind of again, devoid of whether your side is actually right or not, but just because it's your side, your team, whatever. That's kind of the tribal mentality, that it's like the tribe, the team, the party in this instance. That's what matters, and you need to preserve that and can't criticize that or whatever. And corresponding to that, and it plays into or flows from the other points that I've noted, is not just seeing the other side as maybe wrong, misguided, or sharing different values, but like as fundamentally evil, right? Or unworthy of respect and respect for their own rights. And, I think there's a dangerous trend, certainly in current American culture and really around the world, of how tribalism is doing that to us. And then I think you see it then just reflected in the way the parties wield power against the other side when they get it. Um, and then the last one, which to me is maybe perhaps the most significant one, is just a lack of shared valuing of freedom, that certainly here in America and the wider Western world that we are a product of, and in many ways the apotheosis of all of human achievement politically, is a free society. And that's what our project is about, is how do we make 1776 forward, it's in the name, that was a great defining moment in human history, and the greatness that's within it we want to take and expand and make even better and build off of. But because of all these other factors that I just noted and many others that I didn't and that you've noted, it's like I just, you sense that shared valuing, which frankly could bring us together and take the bite out of so many of these, individual concrete disputes, is dissipating and waning. And that too, I think, has ultimately negative effects on our political culture. So that's my rant of even just 5 things that I see wrong with contemporary. I could do a lot more, but I'll stop there. This is such as the nature of ranting, and just see if you had anything else to say. Um, Otherwise I can kind of continue.
Well, I'd love to pick up even where you left off. Like, I think this last point you made is a really important one, and one that we don't unfortunately hear enough of in the culture, which is this idea that political freedom was and is an achievement. That this was really humanity kind of breaking itself out of systems that did not work as well to something that was working much better, and that we are in real risk of losing it. There's that cry of, just wanting people to not only not let it go, but as you pointed out, to make it even that much grander. That if 1776 was a high point, that we don't want it to be the high point. We can see the vision. That's why our organization is 1776 forward, that we can see the vision to not only not let it go, but to make it even more of what it could be and ought to be. And then I would want to connect that way back with the first point you were making, and one that I think is another one that really is lost on most people, as you were pointing out, that perhaps a lot of people, if you talk to them one on one, share much of the sentiment, but feel powerless. And I think one of the grandest achievements of the achievement of freedom was that government was made to be the servant of the people, and that it is we, the individuals, who ought to be the ones to have the power distributed amongst us, and through a system of rights and things that we're going to talk about, but that the power really ought to inhere within us. And one of my rants would definitely be that we live in a system where that's not the case. But if it's not the case, it is because so many of we the individuals have ceded that power. So I think that's also why I think it's so important that you and I see for our project of getting people to step into and take back their power, as we've talked
Yeah.
about in previous episodes. And just something that I think we can't emphasize enough. And that for anyone listening to this, that if you feel powerless, the real question is, how do you reclaim back the power that ought to be yours in a system of freedom?
100%. And it's in the byline of our Substack. We talked about it at the very beginning of this series. So a little plug if you want to go back and catch up and didn't see those early episodes. But that our mission with 1776 forward is really two-pronged. It's thinking first principles and having all of these deep dive discussions and theorizing about the philosophical side, but then the liberty side, or the liberalism side, is then being action oriented towards building up that free society. And so that is a lot of what we're about, is to you know, this itself is an act by Joia and me of us taking back our own power in our own lives, and we hope to empower you all through our efforts and ideas, and hopefully the ones you share with us of how we can collectively do more of that. And just some other reflections on, to tie it back to the question that animates tonight's discussion of how do our core values relate to politics. Just some thinking through my rant got me to think through reasons why, or how kind of our ideal of philosophical liberalism is an antidote to some of the things that I ranted about, and kind of taking them in turn. On that first one of lack of principles and coherency, you know part of the reason why we even did the deep dive mini series on our core values is that those are the core values, because they really ground and animate the what for question of why we want a free society. And so by having those, and by staking a claim for these core values, and then elucidating what they really entail, we feel that can give a sense of order and coherence that people can then take through and apply in political issues. Ask, how does whatever debate or topic that I'm debating, or policy issue that I'm examining, how does it advance those values or not? That's a reference point you can use. um, on the second point, like we said, the whole aim of philosophical liberalism is, and our organization is, to step back, see the big picture, and ask these first principles questions. So that's an antidote to a lack of first principles thinking, certainly. And we hope to be modeling that in ourselves. We're trying to do that as we think through these issues for ourselves, and share it with you all if it helps you in thinking through these issues. um, you know, on the third point about just lack of decorum and respect, character, we've already talked about it a lot. Frankly, it was core to the three core values. We talked about how being action oriented and building up a lot of virtues that's one of the things we find so empowering and inspiring about this ideal. And just inherently, the more we build that up, those virtues of character, it will help us all to counteract the pull of social media or external negative influences, the politics and culture around us, when it wants to drag us into the mud with it. On the fourth point about tribalism over principles, you know, by trying to sketch out some broad-based universal principles that can unite us and that are explicitly non-partisan. That's another way in which we hope to transcend this negative pull that we see in the culture. I mean, we to us, and by design, we are explicitly nonpartisan, because to us, well, as you rightly noted, Joya, neither party has a lock or monopoly on logical consistency, and certainly not freedom-based values and policies. So neither of them can really give us the answers anyway. And so, we hope that philosophical liberalism, in fact, can be a kind of third way or antidote to the absence of that there. And be something that people from whatever political persuasion can come around to and unite. And then the last one, just about freedom. I mean, it's kind of the whole point of our project, right? Is to ground this ideal of philosophical liberalism, the statement we wrote, the manifesto even that preceded it, and showed the real world implications and applications of freedom to daily life and events. That's all of what this is about, is to kind of consistently help us hammer home and remind ourselves of why freedom is so precious, and therefore, you know important to preserve and advance.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's just a beautiful demonstration of my earliest point of how our ranting ultimately should get us to the more productive thinking of, okay, this is where our discontent lies. What can we do about it? And what are possible solutions? And how can we actually start to experiment, take action, and move forward with making change? So maybe we can now transition to the next part of our topic. And I'm happy to take the lead here. We wanted to really start to explicate more thoroughly why, well, first, why we even spent so many episodes talking about freedom, flourishing, and greatness in what is our political project, and then where we're going next. And the way that I see this is that politics is a crucial component of a life of freedom, flourishing, and greatness. You cannot have these things without politics. So it's a core component of it. And that ultimately, this is the goal of politics, I would say, at least for me, that what I care about with politics is not arguing with people about, I don't know, abortion or healthcare or should we legalize marijuana. I care about politics to the extent that it furthers freedom, flourishing, and greatness. And so, just maybe to say a little bit more on that, if you go back to some of our previous episodes, we talked about freedom in a very broad sense. But one of the ways I see it is that all of our freedoms are like a whole. So you can't even perhaps talk about your financial freedom, like what I hope to gain as an entrepreneur, without thinking about the economic freedom of society at large, or how could I even think about the time freedom that I would have to do with my life, pursue my interests and activities if I don't have a political system that recognizes my rights to pursue my happiness in the words of our declaration. And then, as we've talked about flourishing and greatness again, that we've talked about there clearly have been examples of individuals who've achieved some measure of flourishing or some measure of greatness in spite of a lack of freedom, and often as people who fought bravely and boldly for freedom. We talked about heroes like Frederick Douglass or an Alexander
Mhm.
Solzhenitsyn or a Viktor Frankl, people who unfortunately suffered the worst of the the tyrannies of a lack of freedom and who built heroism in their character precisely through their struggle for freedom. But again, part of that was even just that fight for politics. So again, this is just how, as I see it, you know, politics is part of freedom, flourishing, greatness. But what I personally really care about is this wide-ranging sense of how do you and I and the people around us and humanity at large achieve freedom, flourishing, and greatness. And as I see it, we can't really do that without talking about politics, which I think even you and I have obviously talked about this so much. We each have our own separate career paths that we're pursuing, but we both recognize the importance of having to do this kind of project because how can we even achieve the goals that we want for our careers and our lives if we don't have some modicum of political and economic freedom? And the more political and economic freedom we have just enhances our ability to flourish and pursue greatness in our lives.
Wonderfully put. I love that. I'm not sure I have too much to add to that. I mean, it's funny hearing you kind of talk through that. Uh, you know, what was I thinking? Oh, just like it strikes me as funny how, in a way, our answer here implies that politics is implicated in everything, and therefore we need to elevate its importance. And yet I'm just laughing because to me, another rant I have with the current state of our politics is that it is infused and invaded every area of our life, and not in a good way, right? And I mean, I would argue as a freedom advocate that the reason it is because we don't have freedom in many respects, and as our government has gotten bigger and bigger and encroached on our rights and overstepped its constitutional limitations more and more, that's part of the problem, and therefore we feel it on a day-to-day basis. So, I think what we are advocating is, oddly, it's not quite the libertarian position that we want to get to such a free society that we don't have to even worry about politics, because I don't believe in that. And we're going to talk later on about our view and ideal of active civic engagement as what we think is a better model of preserving, maintaining, and advancing a free society. Um, but there is a way in which, to your point, the reason why these matter to politics and vice versa is because a life of freedom, flourishing, and greatness does depend on a free society, and the freer the society is, the more of that we can get. And so I believe, part of why I've always been so passionate about politics and philosophy is probably because of this very connection that I realized early on, well before I could ever give voice to it in articulate, conscious identification. But I grasped on some level that these things mattered for the life I wanted to live and do and be. I mean, and also just as a gay man, even, and growing up, certainly almost 40 years ago, 30 years ago, in my youth, when it was far less socially accepted, like I sensed even viscerally then the power of freedom or its absence to just even live fully as I am. So yeah, so it's like, I guess that probably played into my grasping of this very fact before I could certainly give voice to it. But yeah, I mean, I don't have much else to add, just except to echo, like you said, if you think back to the formula, the really elegant and simple and I think beautiful formula we came up with about our core values, that freedom begets flourishing, begets greatness, and then begets freedom, a higher level of freedom in the upward spiral. Um, Politics and that represents what we mean by freedom as a means and an end to a life of greatness. Politics is, in a sense, a synonym or stand-in here for freedom. So a free society begets a more flourishing life, and one where we can maximize our greatness and potential. And the more we do that, the more I think we're going to be engaged in the project of building and advancing a free society. And to tie back to a point that we did talk about in our greatness discussion, personally, I do think that and we talked about, I think, even one of the core components of our ideal of greatness is that you because you recognize this point that freedom is such a key ingredient to a life of flourishing and greatness, that part of your calling to go beyond yourself and impact the wider world around you is to pick up the cause of freedom and to make it expand its potential for more people around you.
I would just want to point out that I think one of the things that you've demonstrated in what you've said that might not perhaps have been obvious is that you've demonstrated how we are, in fact, very different from the libertarian position. Because the libertarians, most of them, their fundamental is what they call the NAP, the non aggression principle. And while you and I would agree that it would be morally wrong and we should have a political system that does not allow the initiation of coercion and force, that's not the fundamental. That our way of approaching the fundamental is through first principles to ask why and what for. And our important what for is flourishing and greatness. It's about building yourself up into a hero and living a heroic life in a way that contributes to society, and so that we have flourishing individuals and flourishing societies. And maybe that even now just takes us into the last topic that we wanted to talk about on this issue, which is thinking about what this means for character development. So maybe you can take the lead on saying something there.
Yeah, it struck me as I was thinking through this question for myself, um, that you know, as we've been saying, and why there are core values, like what really animates us, what we think is the real purpose and what for of life itself, which is to aspire to and achieve freedom, flourishing, and greatness. Um, that core components of all of those are the building of a good character. So if we're now saying here and making the connection to politics, that politics is almost a stand-in for that freedom component, um, and certainly provides a necessary kind of precondition or foundation, then it follows that a politics of freedom requires a certain level of character development and virtue. And in fact, you may recall, and if you've read our statement, you'll definitely recall that we even defined freedom as living independently, interdependently with responsibility. And that last word, responsibility, it's a key one. We're going to talk about it. We're going to devote a whole session to it, but that's a virtue. That's an element of human character when we talk about something like responsibility. And so when we're saying here that freedom slash politics is entails responsibility, this to me is the link of, again, why these three core values matter to our political project, because you need good character, I would argue, and we're going to argue, we certainly have already put forth in our ideal of philosophical liberalism, to sustain and maintain a free society. We're going to get all into why, so we'll table that or put a pin in that discussion for now. But I think that's just the key point, is the importance of character. And any student of history, any student of American history, and the founding fathers will note that they too talked a lot about this aspect. The famous phrases of, you know, a free republic, if you can keep it, or, it's only for a moral and religious people, they put, because at that time religion and morality were equated with each other, things like that. But this is not a novel insight per se, but I think we are trying to do and have done a little more work on trying to articulate specific dimensions of what that means and entails, and try and make the connection a little more explicit. But that's the key point here, is another reason why they matter, is that insofar as we need good character to sustain and advance a free society, and insofar as a life and an ideal of freedom, flourishing, and greatness gives us a lot of the roadmap to that character building, then the two are kind of symbiotic and mutually reinforcing, I guess, is what I would say.
And you've now set us up for the next steps of our journey. So to this point that, our whole impetus and purpose here is to focus on living lives of freedom, flourishing, and greatness, and recognizing that politics is just deeply interwoven with that. But we're not starting with just, well, for example, like the non-aggression principle. We're starting with, to achieve freedom, flourishing, and greatness, we're starting with thinking about what is human nature at our best, and just pulling out some of the key observations about what that means that are going to lead to what we need to achieve flourishing and greatness. We've obviously given certain indications in our conversations about freedom, flourishing, and greatness of what we think that is, and you'll find more if you read in our statement, but that's where we're going to go to next. And then after that, even thinking about what it is about character development and the virtues that are required of individuals to have a society where everyone is empowered to be living independently, and with responsibility. And then it's only after all of that foundation that we then actually talk about some of these more nitty-gritty questions of things like how maybe ought you structure a society, and maybe what are certain core principles that you would need in terms of your politics, your constitution, your governmental structures, and such.
Exactly. Or said differently, what Joya just described is our next session's question, which is why did we structure our statement on philosophical liberalism in the three parts that it follows? So again, if you haven't read it yet, this is our plug. Go to our website, 1776forward.com. It's right there at the top of the page. After our intro is our statement on what we mean by philosophical liberalism, and you'll see there that we broke it into three core sections or articles, as we call them. So, as a good entry into that next session, we thought we would do a quick little overview of why we even broke it out the way we did. So that's what's coming up as a preview in 2 weeks. And then I guess that just leads us into our call to action for this week. So as Joya, you rightly, I think, put it, that there's good ranting and bad ranting, and good ranting is where we vent, we talk it out like we just did, and then we even start to think through some positive solutions as we did, and then we take action to bring those into reality. So we thought for this week, in particular, since a lot of our rants centered around discourse and political debate and how we discuss and debate and communicate with other people on political matters, there was this great, when I was kind of studying philosophy and starting to learn how to think critically or otherwise, um, in my later teenage years, I came across this really great logical fallacies chart. For those of you who don't know, logical fallacies are just essentially shoddy thinking. They're shortcuts, and almost tricks, mental tricks you can think that people use to make their argument appear stronger and more logically coherent than it actually is, um, and that don't withstand logical scrutiny when you step back and critically examine them. They often feed, frankly, off of a very charged and rapid fire and non-reflective debate type of scenario where you're reacting more so than thinking and examining critically. So, and they're rampant. They're almost ubiquitous in our modern culture. And I think we're all guilty of them. I've certainly used them and can still succumb to them. But the value of this chart is that it help me be aware of them, and then so I could start to catch them and not use them as much. So we're going to share this in the link at the bottom. And we want to just give it to you all so that you can use it in your own life. But the call to action is, and you may recall from last week's session, we established that we're kind of shifting the call to action to a two-part framing of action that builds up your self-leadership and then action that builds up leadership in your community. So we want you to, or we invite you and call you to use this logical fallacies chart that we're gonna share, go through the list. There's many of them, and pick just two or three that really resonate with you, or even that are just the easiest ones for you to understand and grasp and or see in yourself. And for the self leadership, take two or three and then just observe when you're talking and debating in the 2 weeks ahead when you might use them and be on the lookout for them and maybe even take note of when you use them and try and catch yourself so that then you can start to hopefully build better habits of not going to those kind of fallback positions or arguments in future debates. And then the kind of community leadership at second part of the call to action on this on the community leadership side is essentially do the same thing. You can use either the same two or three fallacies or different ones. Be on the lookout for other people using them, either politicians on TV or friends that you're debating online or in person, or even just non-political contexts, people that you have to argue with for work or whatever. And you can either note it mentally in your head when people use it, you can call them out on it and say, aha, you're using the straw man fallacy there, and that's not a real argument, to use one example. Or you can politely share the sheet with them and say, here, look over this and you can help you strengthen your arguments too. So anyways, that is our two-part call to action. And Joy and I are gonna do the same. It's a really cool, nifty sheet, and we will report back to all of you in 2 weeks. So that's all I got. Anything else you want to close with?
I just add 2 points actually on this. The first point being that we've talked about the importance of taking responsibility and stepping into taking back your power, and this whole idea of building up your leadership of yourself and over others. This is sort of the first steps of doing that, of becoming a stronger leader of yourself, of gaining that power over your life and the contribution you can make to community and society around you. And the second point is more of a technical one, which is that this PDF is only going to be available on our Substack. So if you're just watching this on YouTube, you do have to go, you'll find the link and be able to subscribe to our Substack. But only subscribers on Substack will actually be able to get the document itself. So there's hopefully motivation if you haven't yet to subscribe to the Substack.
I love it. Yes, well said.
Mm.
And yeah, that's a great point. Part of why I even like this call to action is that gaining more control over your mind is part of how you can take back your power and step into your power, um, for life in general, but certainly for political life as well. So that's what we hope to inspire.
And to contribute hopefully to the discourse around you as
Oh
well.
yeah, for sure, 100%. And to that end, please do, as always, share with us in the comments, DMs, or email replies your findings from this and just what you liked, didn't like. We really love the feedback, and it's how we can improve and make sure that we're delivering for you all. But use whatever medium you're comfortable with. And otherwise, we'll see you back in 2 weeks. As always, be sure to subscribe and share it with anyone else who you think would enjoy this and benefit.
See you next time.
See you next time. Thanks.